To unpack the real issues affecting the Tasman nations, this is Trans-Tasman Talk. Jointly produced by the Unshackled.net and rightminds.nz. Now here's Tim Willems in Australia and Dewey DeBoer in New Zealand.
Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Trans-Tasman Talk. The date is Tuesday the 27th of October 2019. It is 7 p.m. here in Melbourne.
And it is 9 p.m. here in Auckland.
We are live on the Unshackled's YouTube channel. You can comment in the live chat and also send through super chats if you want me to read out your comment live on the air.
And you can also watch on the Right Minds YouTube channel, and I'll be monitoring the chat there, as always. We don't have super chats enabled yet, but we are working on that. Please do subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell, and you'll get notified, and you'll also help us get those super chats.
Now, you and I, the Unshackled.net and rightminds.nz, we're part of the alternative media. So, of course, we're left out of the commentary about the legacy media as they battle to survive.
Yes, and the legacy media in New Zealand is most definitely struggling. MediaWorks has recently announced that their TV, free-to-air TV, TV3, is going up for sale. They posted a $5.5 million loss last year. They've also cancelled some of their shows, including the Guy Williams show, which has featured on Trans-Tasman Talks before, when he interviewed a gang member with tattoos on his cheeks. They've also cancelled some of their political commentary shows like 7 Days and New Zealand's Married at First Sight. And with the entire network up for grabs, if they don't sell by December, before Christmas, then the project could go as well, and we could see the end of TV3 and people like, great commentary from Patrick Gower.
Yes, well, TV3, its news division is called News Hub, and Patrick Gower, who I call the Alex Mann of New Zealand, our Australian audience will know who I'm talking about. Your New Zealand people won't, but it's a worthy comparison. And of course, he was one of the presenters on the current affairs program, or they'd probably like to call it public affairs, because it matters. And I remember one of your articles is because it matters to News Hub, or we call it Fake News Hub. Yes,
and that's what they named their new show that's now no longer going to be there, because it matters. And yes, but News Hub is staying, just so people know. News Hub is basically the website, online news, and yeah, they're most definitely keeping that, and I believe they have some radio elements that they're hanging on to as well.
We had the Turnbull government in the last parliament change the cross-media ownership laws because they're redundant now, given that there's online and there's not just TV, print and radio. And so that saw Channel 9 and the Fairfax newspapers merge, and they're also taking over Macquarie Media, which includes 2GB, the home of Alan Jones. So, well, Sky News Australia, they dug up something not 100% polite Jacinda Ardern said about Alan Jones 7 years ago.
That's right. Jacinda's old tweets have been sifted through, and in some kind of bombshell report, the Sky News reported that she had called Alan Jones a git, and said that nobody, or not very many people liked him, or he was intensely disliked. That's I believe what I'm going for there. And that was supposed to shatter Jacinda's pristine image, although I think you and I both agree that that's reaching a little bit far, and calling somebody a git is probably about as polite as it gets in the media world.
Yes, how dare she? I mean, you and I are not fans of Jacinda, obviously, but that's given what's on Twitter most of the time, the abuse and all that sort of stuff, especially at Alan Jones' himself, given that, well, somebody decided to paint a mural of him with a BDSM ball gag in his mouth, which was pretty vile. Jacinda Ardern calling him a git and questioning his popularity in the Australian public, I think.
Yeah, exactly. And it was 2012 as well, when she was in. I can't remember exactly when she entered Parliament. I believe it was the previous election or the one before then. But so the idea that somehow this tarnishes her image, I think that's a very far-fetched idea that Sky News is going for. And I think a few people will run with it, but more as a joke, and it's not really a serious kind of scandal in this day and age.
Oh, I saw that Winston Peters was asked, how can you stand by her, given that she used this appalling language?
Yeah, and I haven't seen his response. I saw the headline there as well, but I'm guessing his response would have been something far worse than Jacinda calling anybody a git.
Well, he said something like, oh, it's not the Jacinda Ardern that I know. She's always been very collegial. And then he was asked, oh, should she apologize?
Yeah, that's and I always hate it when they do that. And yeah, I mean, sure, they the left would try and call out anybody on the right, but I think we have the moral high ground here, and there's no need to go and run around for apologies. But it is a little bit humorous to see. In a very, very small sense, the left eat their own here, or take a tiny little bite, because this is not entirely consistent with her image. And Winston Peters on that subject as well, he completely ripped into MediaWorks, into TV3 as well. He said good riddance when he was asked about them. He spent several days trashing them and staying in the media cycle. And there has been the possibility has been raised that the government will basically bail them out. So we have NZ On Air funding that they can get, and there are several media outlets that get that, including TV3. But basically, they could get more taxpayer money to prop them up. And obviously, they're already getting a lot of taxpayer money as it is, and he has still toyed with that. But I think it's very unlikely that we're going to see any kind of government bailout here.
What we've seen in Australia over the past decade is both Labor and Liberal governments have consistently slashed the licensing fees for television and radio, just to basically so they can keep up or reduce their expenses. And we saw Channel 7 recently, one of the other major broadcast media networks. They axed a whole bunch of their news coverage, including their Sunday night news magazine program. The reason why people believe that the Nine and Fairfax merger was stroke of genius, and now of course they've got Macquarie Media and 2GB, is they can now pool their resources, which is what you've got to do now. I mean, there's no real difference because print journalists, they're on TV as well now. It's not just simply you're either a editor and a reporter writing stories or presenting and broadcasting them. It's you're a jack of all mediums now. And News Corp Australia, which is obviously the biggest media company, they're able to pool their newspaper resources with Sky News Australia, which they own 100% of now. So there's a lot of crossover between their newspaper coverage and Sky News, and a lot of the News Corp columnists appear on Sky News as commentators.
And we have quite a bit of overlap in New Zealand as well, but a lot more between radio and print at the moment. And the big TV, it was News Hub that had, MediaWorks that had News Hub, Magic on the radio, and then TV3 on air. And that's now fallen apart. It's a pretty tough world. And recently a merger between Stuff and NZME, which was basically New Zealand Herald and Newstalk ZB. A merger between those was declined by the government as being too monopolistic. But they were upset because it would lead to cutting their content. But we can see that a lot of the legacy, the way the legacy media works, is not a sustainable business, and they're slowly having to shrink or merge all of their assets.
Of course, the BS narrative is this means there's less scrutiny on government, less media diversity, which means they completely exclude, well, not just us, but all the independent news websites that have popped up over the years. Obviously, the big one that you've had in New Zealand was Whale Oil Beef Hooked, which has been replaced. I keep forgetting its name.
With the BFD.
Yes, and there's also a left-wing...
thebfd.co.nz. Yep.
And there's also a left-wing one.
Outlet, the spin-off, I think,
yes,
is probably the biggest left-wing one, yeah.
And we've had plenty of alt media online for a number of years, both on the left and the right. There's the Pickering Post, there's Michael Smith News. There on their right wing, on the left, there's Independent Australia. There's the New Matilda. Then there's the sort of trash pop culture rags of junkie and pedestrian TV. Obviously, I call them trash, but of course they're allowed to exist and report on silly stuff that happens online. But yeah, the mainstream media, they're getting increasingly frustrated that their revenue is draining. They claim that they put in all the hard yards and do all the research and that. It's easy when they've already got assets and made millions of dollars over the past 50 years. And of course, that's why we saw after the 2016 presidential election, they wanted a crackdown on fake news. And of course, we've seen big tech now, Facebook and Google and YouTube, they're promoting authoritative voices. And this year on YouTube, we've seen a flood of mainstream media moving over there at the expense of independent content creators.
And we see a lot of the independent content creators do a lot of the hard yards themselves. We've talked a lot about Avi Yemeni in Australia on this show. Just before the show, you and I were talking about the hard yards being done by the Rebel in Canada with their elections today. And so the independent and alternative media is down there on the ground. Many of them in the United States as well, in the UK, Tommy Robinson, and so on. So the clickbait essentially was the driving business behind the legacy media. They go sell ads and clicks on websites to get ads, and then ad spots on TV. So they just got to sell ads, and they're churning out content to sell these ads. And all of the new media and the alt media largely runs on donations. Thanks to all of those people who give us donations. If you're watching, hello to those in the chat. You can give a super chat, and Tim will read it out on the Unshackled channel, or if you leave a comment on the Right Minds channel, I can read that out. And a lot of the alt media is driven mostly via donations and people paying for the content directly. And the legacy media is really struggling there to convert into having people actually voluntarily pay up for content.
Well, there's obviously we have the Guardian in Australia, which is originally a UK newspaper, but in Australia it's online, and even in their online form, especially in Australia, they're a digital operation, so you'd consider them I wouldn't consider them alt media, but just new media. Yeah. They obviously at the beginning could rely on ad revenue, but now they're asking for donations as well. There's sort of three, I would say, three different levels of media. There's the establishment legacy media, which is newspapers, radio, television. Then there's I would say the new media that's been accepted as mainstream. So Huffington Post, BuzzFeed, Vice, that's sort of acceptable new media that are allowed to get press passes to parliaments and the White House, that sort of thing.
And I should mention here in New Zealand as well, the New Zealand Herald has made a successful transition into subscription-based reporting as well. They seem to be doing pretty well with that. So it's the ones who are truly relying on the old, selling ad spots and selling, and driving clicks through for AdWords and so on. They're the ones who are genuinely struggling.
Now, of course, they'd like us to go away, us in the alt media, because we ruin their... They like to be the gatekeepers. They get to decide what is is reported and who's given a platform, which is why they don't care if we're kicked off social media or we're affected by new hate speech laws that are passed by the parliament. But it's interesting that they never thought that such government laws or directions could be used against them, because there's been two federal police raids on mainstream media journalists. There was a raid on News Corp journalist Annika Schmethurst. She published a story about the Australian Signals Directorate, how they wanted to increase their surveillance on everyday Australians when it's supposed to be a defence signal, well, as its name suggests, checking what signals are coming in from overseas. And then the ABC, our state broadcaster, they got their officers raided over a series of reports called the Afghan Files, which alleged our soldiers in Afghanistan covered up potential mistreatment and atrocities. It's funny that they're the cheerleaders of restrictions on freedom and silencing those they disagree with. They never think it's going to affect them, but they've been very triggered by these police raids, and so why they launched on Monday the your right to know, and this was the front of, this is the Melbourne Murdoch paper, the Herald Sun. And so it says, news restrictions, secrecy, jail terms for journalists and whistleblowers. It couldn't happen in Australia. It's happening now. When the government starts hiding the truth from Australians, what are they covering up? And they've got a website, yourrighttoknow.com.au. And it's interesting that this coalition of media organisations, it's called a united front. There is all of the media outlets. They are licensed television or radio networks, or their newspapers, well, news outlets that have once been newspapers. The only ones that aren't newspapers in Australia are Daily Mail Australia and Guardian Australia, which I already mentioned have been newspapers over in the UK. So it's basically your right to know what we want to tell you. And this is, they believe that they're the authoritative journalists, the real journalists, because they basically want exemptions from national security laws. I'll just go through it's actually quite hard to navigate this website they've set up. If I...
You had a similar situation with CNN during the 2016 campaign in the United States, where they said, it's illegal to read Hillary's emails, but we can read them for you and tell you what they are.
Yeah.
And they want special laws for them. We've had cases in New Zealand too with journalists raided because they'd broken the law, and then said, oh well, we were breaking the law, for the common good. And normally that doesn't apply.
I've got it. I'll just, I may as well just, I'll put it over your face if you don't mind.
That's fine. Yeah. You can.
Yeah. So this is their demands. What we want. To make sure journalists and their sources can expose wrongdoing without fear of reprisal, we're seeking a suite of reforms. The right to contest the application for warrants for journalists and media organisations. Exemptions for journalists from laws that will put them in jail for doing their jobs, including security laws enacted over the past 7 years. So they're actually after special treatment there. And of course, what is a journalist? They would say that they're the real journalists. Public sector whistleblowers must be adequately protected. And then, of course, there's what is a whistleblower. Of course, there is genuine bad things that the bureaucracy is doing and keeping secret. But then, of course, there's alleged whistleblowers. They're some of the time they're people with an axe to grind, or it's part of some part of payback to the governments that's in charge. A new regime which limits which documents can be kept secret. I don't mind that. Properly functioning freedom of information regime. I don't mind that. And defamation law reform. Now, Probably the most concerning new development in Australian defamation law has been that Australian media companies are liable for comments that are posted on social media with their stories, because Dylan Voller, who was this youth Aboriginal criminal, mainstream media published a whole bunch of stories about his criminal history, and like the comments under those stories, can you imagine, don't hold him in high regard. And so he launched a class action against a lot of them, and a preliminary ruling was issued, which basically said that, yes, not Facebook is liable for the comments published on its platform, but the media organization, even though the comments are on Facebook, not on their actual websites.
Yeah, that's a really bad court ruling, and you'd be looking to have that overturned or have some law passed to undo that. Interestingly enough, in New Zealand, we have media voluntarily censoring comments on their social media accounts. Most of them, more than happy to remove comments on their Facebook pages. But you can see a lot of them, especially in a larger country, they're going to get hundreds or thousands of comments on almost every post. And that's not something that's reasonable for anybody to manage on a social media account.
I remember Andrew Bolt, you'd know who he is in New Zealand, Australia's most prominent conservative commentator. He started his online blog way before Facebook started, and so people commented directly on his blog. The way before Facebook and groups were the forums. You remember those online forums? You're old enough to remember, I assume.
Just barely.
Yes. Yes. Well, Andrew Bolt, because there were people eager to pick up on the comments that were posted on his blog, he had to employ moderators for it. And because they didn't work weekends, the stuff that he posted on Saturday and Sunday, feedback couldn't be given because there were no moderators. But that just gives you an indication of, in the digital age, that online journalism, you're held accountable for the comments that if they're supportive of you, they're a reflection of you. But of course, that only applies to right-wing commentators and non-leftist media outlets.
Yes, and always when people ask about social media, comments on social medias and posts, I always say, well, we do the bare minimum in terms of moderation, and people should be taking responsibility for their own comments, and comments should not be seen as endorsed by the platform that they're posted on, and that tends to be far more effective and doesn't waste everybody's time, because people can see who's making the speech should be owning the speech, and you shouldn't be holding the platforms liable. And that goes further to deplatforming in the real world as well, where we have an ongoing story in New Zealand with Massey University, the famous anti-free speech university. They've just had 2 more strikes against their name this week. They cancelled a feminist talk because the feminists were opposed to the trans movement and the transgender ideology. They wanted women's spaces to remain for women, and women's sports to remain for women. And again, the whole drama of health and safety went on, and eventually the feminist event was cancelled. A very famous feminist columnist, Rachel Stewart, who wrote for the New Zealand Herald, actually had them refuse to publish one of her columns on this subject. So she quit, and it was republished by all of the blogs and alt media, and even, I believe, 1 or 2 other mainstream media organizations. And then just today, it's been revealed as well that Massey University has pulled down all the pro-Hong Kong posters on the university. So there's no more standing up for Hong Kong, no free Hong Kong stickers or posters allowed anywhere at Massey University. And we suspect they've, are worried about losing the money from, Chinese exchange students, just as the cancelling the feminist event was because it was threatened they would have their rainbow tick removed. And so they basically have, bowed down to the more powerful forces and, continue to deplatform people at a university.
How far we've come, that there used to be a tick for that food was healthy for your heart, the Heart Foundation tick. Now we have the more important tick to get these days is rainbow tick, that you're supportive 100% of the LGBTQ agenda.
Yes, except for apparently the feminists or lesbian women and so on. They're not important anymore. They've been pushed off the edge. Right after the gay men got pushed off the edge, a couple of months ago, they kind of moved on. Like, if you're not on board with the latest letter they've stuck on the end of it, then the front letter slowly get chopped off one at a time.
Well, the TERFs in Australia, they've been completely blasted into oblivion. All the major feminists, for example, Clementine Ford and Van Badham, they support transgender women. They believe trans women are women, and they also support legal sex work, that it's a woman's right to consensually engage in sex work. So they've well and truly sort of won the third wave feminists and the LGBT section of that movement.
And we have very few of those left in New Zealand. I suspect this particular event and this columnist, Rachel Stewart, I believe they were sort of the last of the standing, second wave feminists, probably, if you can call them that. Although, I think Rachel Stewart was very famous as a third wave feminist until, she realized that her own revolution was coming for her. And that women's spaces would be removed. The entire concept of being a woman would be obliterated. That no woman would ever win women's sports again. And she realized that and didn't want to get with the program. After that, you're on the chopping block.
So we've seen play out, these two raids were in June of this year. It's now October. There's been a parliamentary committee on answering this question, how to balance what's termed public interest journalism and national security laws. And the federal police, they haven't at this stage ruled out charging the journalists. They definitely want to charge the whistleblowers. And the Secretary of the Department of Home Affairs, Mike Pizzullo, he's probably Australia's most powerful bureaucrat, because our Department of Home Affairs takes in the Australian Federal Police, ASIO, our domestic surveillance organisation, and the Border Force. And with regard to the Australian Signal Directorate leaks, he basically said this is not a case of a noble whistleblower. This was a intra-agency conflict dispute, and so this whistleblower should go to jail. He was pretty open about saying that, which goes what I get to what I was saying before, that not all whistleblowers are noble. There is certainly one noble whistleblower, and this is, I'll just get the story up here. The Australian Taxation Office, they were directly taking money out of people's personal bank accounts and they weren't informing them. You could just open your bank account and just notice that the government had just seized your money. So Richard Boyle, he worked for the Australian Taxation Office. He blew the whistle on this because the public had no knowledge of it. It was something that they just decided to do, and now he's facing 161 years in jail. That is a genuine public interest whistleblower. Yes. I think that it basically is up to the public to judge who's a real whistleblower or who's just, like, for example, Trump, for example, the deep state, their leaks and whistleblowers, of course, they're noble against the orange man fascist. Yeah.
But it's done for a purely partisan purpose, right? Yeah. When you see things like that happen, and this is why you should have, whistleblower laws that protect people who would be genuine whistleblowers, and you do have, have a public interest case where all of these things get balanced up together, And someone who highlights genuine injustice is protected by the whistleblower laws. But somebody who is deliberately targeting certain political factions, and it's clear that they have a connection to another faction, then you're no longer dealing with somebody who's acting in good faith as a whistleblower.
It's been criticised that the Attorney General in Australia, which is Christian Porter, he gets the final sign-off over whether journalists can be prosecuted, that apparently this is bad, it should be with an independent person. But I actually think this is a good thing, because the Attorney General, he is an accountable, elected politician. He is accountable to the people, and obviously if he's ordering the prosecution of countless journalists, it's not a good look to the public for his government. But the public service deciding these things, they are unaccountable. I would say this independence from government is actually bad, because they are a law unto themselves. I mean, Peter Dutton, he issued a directorate for the Australian Federal Police not to prosecute journalists, and obviously that sort of hasn't really been followed as to this stage. And so I think it's great that an accountable politician has the final sign-off. And this is what I talk about, the public deciding what is public interest journalism. Like, for example, if like this ATO whistleblower, there should be pressure on the Attorney General to basically, well, he shouldn't just get to decide if journalists are prosecuted, but whistleblowers are. If there's enough public outrage that, this whistleblower, he's basically, the ATO was trying to get away with this secret stealing operation of people's money without their knowledge. He blew the whistle on that. There's enough public anger at something like that. The Attorney General can just say, okay, not going to prosecute this. So this is where I think actually having a politician, a democratically elected politician, because people don't they don't take kindly to thinking that they're living in a police state.
Exactly. And it's a little bit circular with regards to whistleblowers and public accountability. But if you're living in a police state or an authoritarian dictatorship, you don't have whistleblowers. You can't. So if you live in a free democracy, you can have whistleblowers. And it is best to have these important decisions be made by somebody who is completely accountable to the voters, because you can say, oh well, there's a risk that they'll become corrupt and they'll prosecute in a partisan fashion. Well, at that point, you're no longer living in a free country anyway, and the voters would absolutely reject that, whether they're left or right. People would see right through that, and they would reject that. You'd have a couple of people may be prosecuted, but that could be corrected very, very quickly in a democracy. Within 3 to 5 years, you'd have that issue resolved and balance would be restored. You should be able to trust the system in terms of how whistleblowers are handled. And like you've said, you absolutely should have somebody who is elected and accountable making these decisions, because once you start handing these things off to a bureaucrat, well then you're end up in the never-ending nightmare of a deep state, or you do what our current government is trying to do a lot of, is everything gets offloaded onto a working group or a commissioner and so on, and then the government themselves is never actually responsible for any of the outcomes.
If you wanted to be more cynical, you would say that these media organizations, they're throwing their weight around in terms of they also have power over the politicians.
Yeah.
Because there is this thing called the political media complex, which is playing out in the United States at the moment, where the deep state is feeding CNN, New York Times, all of these leaks where President Trump doesn't get to have any private conversations, which, like, obviously we want a government to be as transparent as possible, but does every conversation a national leader have to be disclosed to the public? I mean,
no, of course not. And I can say that we have a left-wing government right now, and I don't like the Prime Minister, but her conversations with other world leaders should absolutely not be public. Right? That's a disaster. It doesn't matter who's running the country. You can't run the country if all of your conversations are public.
So the perfect example in Australia of this political media complex is the Midwinter Ball, which is in the Great Hall of Australia's Parliament House with the politicians and the media. It's called the Rent Seekers Balls because it's basically journalists are wanting to get be on good terms with the politicians so they can get leaks and other scoops and stories. That's what it is, and. We've seen, for example, the mainstream media be a protection racket for a lot of personal scandals. For example, you remember our former Deputy Prime Minister Barnaby Joyce. He had an affair with his media advisor and got her pregnant. Do you remember that?
I don't actually remember that story at all. No.
Yes. Well, the media knew about that in about August of 2017, and it was actually reported by one of the left-wing alt media websites, The Independent Australia, that he'd had an affair with his media advisor. His wife had kicked him out of the home and was pregnant with her child. But the mainstream media did not report this at all, and he actually faced a by-election because he was found to be a dual New Zealand citizen. The Section 44 crisis, and the media did not report this during the New England by-election, and so he got a swing to him. It was only because one mainstream media journalist, Sharry Markson, decided to break this protection racket and report the story on the front of the Daily Telegraph, which is a News Corp Sydney paper, and got a photograph of Vicky Campion, his media advisor, heavily pregnant. And it's well known that for years that politicians, they cover up these personal scandals. Because apparently it's none of our business, their personal lives. But say if you'd want to know if a politician is printing out election leaflets with the wife and children, that's not really true, a reflection of who they are. And so that's an example of how the politicians and the media class have been in cahoots to deny the public the opportunity to make the judgment about Barnaby Joyce's personal life for themselves. And
as you've repeated more details, the case has come back to me, because I did remember this case, but I didn't know that it had actually been buried for that long. I thought it had come out when it was reported, and that's all we ever heard of it. But yeah, the media complex, sometimes referred to as the media party as well, like they are a political entity, and we've seen that in our local elections here recently, where they pick a couple of candidates they put forward, and they're the one, they report on those parties. In the recent polls we talked about last week, the New Conservative Party complained as well, because they were completely left out of the polls. Like, they were not mentioned by either polling company, even though by one of them, they were polling at 1% and at 0.5% and another one. But they didn't get a mention, and so the media gets to try and pick who they want to cover and who they want as the winners and who they want as their politicians. And so there's a very close relationship that goes on there. With the Canadian election today, of course, there was the case of Justin Trudeau's scandals that was, not being covered by the mainstream media there at all. That was something they've completely buried, which I think really worked in Trudeau's favor. Only really the alt media picking that up. And similar in a very small scale with regards to Jacinda in New Zealand. Not a big scandal, but her comrade video. We have a video of her talking about all of her comrades at a international socialist youth meeting, where she says comrade 15 times in 8 minutes. And that video has never been aired by the media in New Zealand, even though you'd think people would want to know that you've got a very happy international socialist running to be prime minister. Or in Canada's case, the blackface wearing mammy singer.
Yes, which was reported by an American news outlet, not a Canadian news outlet. And we'll get to the actual results of the Canadian election at the end of the show. But you and I both watched the Rebel News live stream, which used to be Rebel Media. They've now basically Rebel Media, because obviously they sort of expanded very quickly and had a number of high-profile departures. They've basically settled now on wanting to be a Canadian-focused news video organization, and they sent their reporters all around Canada to ask the politicians questions, and they were frequently blacklisted and persecuted. And because Ezra Levent, he receives lots of money from his supporters, they were able actually to sue the Debates Commission to get a press pass to be in the debate, because they're originally excluded. But not most alt media outlets can't afford such a case. And I remember Rebel News reporters described themselves after that decision as a court-affirmed reporters, because whenever they turned up at press conferences, most of the politicians refused to answer their questions. And there was even one case where probably their best reporter, David the Menzoid Menzies, as he's known, he tried to ask the Conservative leader, Andrew Scheer, whether he believed in free speech. He was arrested and handcuffed and driven across town. And David Menzies, he's not one to give up. He went back and he managed to get into the next event to ask, why was I arrested? But that's basically... It shows that even a major, well-resourced alt media outlet is still treated like they're not a proper licensed. Of course, there's no such thing as a news journalism license, but if you're not sort of in the establishment, then the obviously the Canadian mainstream media blacklisted them, and so did the politicians. Can you imagine if, say, a CBC, which is the Canadian state broadcaster, imagine if one of their reporters was handcuffed and driven away in a police van?
It would be the front page news for the next week or the next 2 weeks, especially if it was done by the Conservative Party leader. You would never hear the end of it. That's the complete opposite for the Rebel, but they keep going, and they had a great broadcast today on the election, and I saw some of their clips of the reporting during the election, and like you said, they continually kept getting asked, where's your license? Where's your license? Like, oi, are you practicing journalism without a license? Continually just going after them. No, you don't need a license to practice journalism. Any citizen is more than free to be a journalist and should be encouraged to be one.
It's a silly thing. What is a journalist? Who gets to be an accredited journalist? Well, they would say in Australia we have what's the Journalists Union, the Media, Entertainment and Arts Alliance. So it's sort of unofficially the belief that unless you're a member of that union, you're not a real journalist. But of course, well, there's journalism schools at universities, but most of the journalism graduates they churn out don't actually get jobs as journalists.
No, it's a good burger flipping degree. I also want to give a shout out to a couple of people in the chat, since I've had a few other people say hi, and particularly a shout out to Julian Assange when we were talking about whistleblowers before, of course, as the original.
He's not a real journalist though. even though,
he's both a journalist and a whistleblower to anybody who's paying attention. But yes, to the media, of course, he's not a real.
Well, Chelsea Manning was the whistleblower who put it was so. This is how unsecure the US government is, that Chelsea Manning was just able to put on a Lady Gaga CD all these cables and give it to Julian Assange to publish. But it's interesting that the mainstream media said, "Oh, he should be locked up, Assange. He's endangering national security." Oh, but we're still allowed to report on the cables that we don't approve that he released. Yeah. So it's okay when we have a hold of this information, but not somebody like Julian Assange.
No, and it's again he falls outside of their of the approved mainstream.
I'm still old enough to remember during the Julia Gillard Labor government, where the Greens supported her, they had a inquiry into Well, the Greens wanted it into media bias because they didn't like that News Corp was saying bad things about them, and so they had the Finkelstein inquiry, it was called, and they proposed a news media council which would have the power to compel, even if you were a blog with 43 views per day, you could be regulated by this and forced to give people a right of reply. They could compel you to publish like apologies and give like your enemies a platform.
Yeah, it's it's just bizarre. And like, especially with the internet, like there's so many blogs out there, so many places where somebody will publish your reply, right? There's always a bigger fish, there's always a bigger blog or a bigger outlet, and the really, we need to tone down a little bit on the regulations, not ramp them up. We want more freedom.
It was just last week that the mainstream media repeated the calls from Muslim politicians in our parliament, Ed Husic and Ali, that ASIO, our domestic surveillance organisation, needed more funding to crack down on the far right. And this is what I get. They want special protection. They want exemptions for for journalists from national security laws, how a journalist is going to be defined, but they're more than happy for our parliaments to pass hate speech laws against ordinary citizens, for them to be under surveillance if they have what are considered extreme views. And so they haven't and they're now talking about all the national security laws that they named 82 that have been passed since 2002. So you're basically admitting, the mainstream media, you've dropped the ball for 17 years with regard to all the national security laws that were passed since September 11. You're only catching up now.
Yeah, that's right. And we've got a new national security bill before our parliament at the moment. Not sure if you've got a similar one similar issue in Australia, but we have a new called anti-terrorism bill. That's of course the way it goes, like Patriot Act or something. You got to give it a nice name, and it was expected to sail through smoothly, but it's actually been opposed now both by the Greens and by the National Party. And for some strange reason, the Green Party in New Zealand is now suddenly concerned that this anti-terrorism bill gives international groups the rights to determine who would be a terrorist in New Zealand. So if a New Zealander goes overseas and they're designated a terrorist somewhere overseas and they come back to New Zealand, they could then be arrested by the police based on this definition from another country. And the Greens suddenly say, oh no, that undermines our sovereignty, even though they've been supporting just about every other piece of legislation that undermines our sovereignty to this date. And then the National Party, on the other hand, is opposed to this bill because it doesn't go far enough. So they want to have more anti-terrorism powers given to the police based on what they do overseas, and it's obviously targeted at ISIS at the moment. I'm using returning ISIS fighters, but it's going to be applied to everybody else 5 minutes later.
This is what I was getting to before, that the media and also the left, they only care about press freedom and free speech if it affects them. Like, for example, the environmental activists, they're now worried about free speech because there's they're proposing new laws to stop them supergluing themselves to the road.
We're getting nothing like the freedom to glue yourself to the road.
But that's noble civil disobedience, didn't you know? What do you know that? Yeah, but of course, what is noble civil disobedience? That's another question.
Yeah, exactly. And since somebody in the chat pointed out, like Chelsea Manning wanted to point out, Chelsea Manning is actually a man. That, for instance, would be hate speech, and it's time for you to go to prison. But and you wouldn't be able to glue yourself to the road from the left. In that case, they'd drag you off. But yeah, if when it comes to their actions, and usually far more disruptive than simply using words, then suddenly they get their knickers in a twist.
I think that's our bitch about the mainstream media and their awfulness and double standards. We've consumed 3/4 of the show, but there's been actual other developments affecting real people in both our nations. Now, I see that there's a lot of people in the live chat on the Unshackled channel. Thank you for all their comments. I recognize all the regulars. Remember, if you have a question or want to make a comment, you can send through a super chat directly on YouTube, because this is the main Unshackled channel, which is monetized. So you don't have to go through entropy or anything like that.
And please do like the videos as well, and share them around on social media. It's great to get a bigger audience, and I see we're getting more viewers every time and more comments every time as well. It's really good to see.
Now, on my Wilmsfront program on Friday night, I had Ron Pike, who is a water consultant and third-generation irrigation farmer, because we're in the midst of the worst drought that we've ever seen. But the real scandal is that this is a self-inflicted drought, is because we have what's called the Murray-Darling Basin, which is a river system which cuts across 4 states, New South Wales, Queensland, Victoria and South Australia. In 2007, the Federal Water Act was passed, which then created the Murray-Darling Basin Authority. It was set up during when Malcolm Turnbull was Water Minister. Basically, the consensus was that farmers were being greedy, using too much water, and we needed to return it to the environment. And so we have what's called environmental flows, basically flushing this water out to sea, never to be seen again. And they've taken away water rights from the farmers, and so you basically have a socialist communist rationing system of water now, which of course has made the price skyrocket. And so the water's there, but the farmers cannot afford it or are being denied access to it, which is why it's a self-inflicted drought. And it's another reason why Australia keeps shooting itself in the foot, as it did with manufacturing, energy policy, and now water.
And it's such a pity if you have got the water sitting around. Here in New Zealand, we have a lot of water, and I've never heard of us having any issues, having access to it or releasing it during droughts, which do happen every now and then. But yeah, it is sad to see, especially in this modern age, in a developed country. It's very rare that you're going to have a drought that's not self-inflicted. I believe the issues they've had in California as well, similar problem where they've put very little effort into upgrading their water systems over the years, and then you've got more and more people coming in and using more water and so on, and then complaining about a drought when you haven't invested in the infrastructure, or in the case of Australia now, where you've deliberately put it out of people's reach.
You talked about in previous episode that Jacinda Ardern doesn't want to do anything too drastic about climate change because it will kill New Zealand's agricultural sector, which is the biggest export. And it sounds that both National and Labor in New Zealand actually, I wouldn't say respect the farmers, but know that they have to do the right thing by them. Well, we have most of rural Australia represented by the National Party, which is the junior coalition partner of the Liberal Party. And they've been in government federally for most of the past 15 years. And in the state of New South Wales, which the drought, rural towns are about to run out of water, they've been in power, the Liberal National Party, since 2011, and they're supposed to give people in the bush a voice, and they've been complicit in all of this, basically let down their voters. Yeah, voters, because they are focused specifically on rural Australia. They only really have one voting base, and they've completely failed them.
Yeah, that's a complete and utter disaster. And I have talked to or heard from someone who's talked to a lot of New Zealand farmers over the past week, and they have mentioned that all of the farmers are actually complaining about the kind of like the slow restriction, especially of environmental regulations in New Zealand. So they do feel like in New Zealand, especially, they are under pressure, but in a very, very slow manner. Like they keep having one little thing piled on after the other. Many of them are getting desperate in terms of costs with environmental compliance these days.
We have got a super chat here on the Unshackled YouTube. It's from Antonio Peco. I know who that is. I'm not going to reveal their identity. They've asked, is Dewey de Boer going for a Kane Williamson look?
Well, will I embarrass myself if I say I don't know who that is?
No, I don't know either. So
Too obscure.
please elaborate. If you just posted it as another comment, I'll still read it out.
Thanks. I have had a comment. I have put some more lights up, by the way. I got a lot of comments last week about my very orange look, and I've got a lot more white light now, and I'm almost the same color as Tim. Where I don't think I'll ever get as pasty white as he is, but we'll work on it.
So you're not using those energy efficient light bulbs, which Donald Trump blames is why he always looks orange.
I actually have one of the lights is actually orange. That was the problem. Is I've added just had to add some white light. So you never know. It could be Trump's problem as well.
He's the New Zealand cricket captain.
You see, I knew I was going to get in trouble. I'll look that up after the show.
Yeah. New Zealand's still in the Rugby World Cup. I just know that Australia's out. That's all I know.
I thought of opening the show with that, but now that we have, everybody's watching, but Australia has done very poorly, and it, probably hasn't helped that you destroyed your team by removing your star player a few months ago, New Zealand is topping the charts, just so you know.
Well, New Zealand has always been the world champions of rugby union. That's basically the only sport you'll ever be world champions of. Well, you're the only nation where it's your national sport.
Oh, yes, it is, yeah.
Now, I'll move on to, because last week in our Australian Parliament, well, there wasn't much that was being debated policy or legislative wise, but it's constantly under speculation that we could be heading towards a recession, and there's been talk of that the economy needs to be stimulated. And because the Reserve Bank of Australia, which sets monetary policy, is independent, again, I hate independent, it should mean unaccountable, because the Reserve Bank governors, they get appointed and can just make whatever monetary policy they like. They have reduced interest rates now to 0.75%, the lowest they've ever been, and they've now actually talked about maybe to save the economy, in their view, they'll need more quantitative easing, which is code for printing more money, which is robbing us through inflation. And also even going to negative interest rates, because the Morrison government, they're not going to do any economic stimulus or fiscal stimulus. They want to achieve the surplus that they've projected for the next financial year, which is 7.1 billion, which obviously, as a person who believes that government debt does burden us all, I think is a good idea. But this is again the return of Keynes, that the economy is demand driven, that all of a sudden if people demand more things, it's suddenly going to get more produce out of the ground, more minerals out of the ground. It doesn't work like that.
Yeah, no, it doesn't. And we're seeing a similar trend in New Zealand as well, where even the negative interest rates is a word that started to appear, because we've dropped 75 base points this year. Check the exact number here. Yes, and so we've gone from nearly 2%, so 1.75 down to 1% as the interest rates. There is talk of another 0.25 point cut next month in November at the next review, which is done by the Reserve Bank as well. Their monetary policy statement, which is due out in about a month, and that'll bring us in line with Australia and on the trend down very quickly. The interest rates are not dropping as quickly though, so the banks are absorbing a nice bit of this margin for themselves, and Yeah, and I want to reinforce the point that you made about the Reserve Bank being, independent and therefore not accountable. It's actually a point that Michael Riddell, who's my favorite local economist here, has been making as well. A lot of these monetary policy decisions are made by somebody who isn't accountable, and maybe they should in fact be made by someone who is accountable to the public.
Also, I forgot to mention during our press freedom debate that in this campaign, there's nothing about there being too many suppression orders issued by courts. For example, George Pell was found guilty of child sexual abuse in December 2018. That was suppressed in Australia, but was reported all around the world, and so, of course, was all over global social media. So what was the point of the suppression order? It was because at the time there was going to be a second trial on a separate charge, but that was eventually dropped, and so the Australian media could report it. But that just showed the lunacy of suppression orders, in that people talk all throughout the internet, and having these suppression orders is basically redundant. And we also saw suppression orders used to basically delay the revelation for a number of years of, in the state of Victoria, a gangland lawyer, Nicola Gobbo. She was representing a lot of, Melbourne had a gangland war, representing a lot of the most prominent figures. She was actually a secret police informant, which goes against how our legal system is supposed to be, that you're entitled to a defense that sticks up for you. And of course, she was secretly ratting on her own clients. Now, the Herald Sun, because they decided to take up this story and they've got millions of dollars, this was where their vast resources were being used for a good thing. They fought for years to get the for it to be able to be reported on, this story. They eventually were able to publish that this was happening, but her name was suppressed. She was just called Lawyer X, but now it's been revealed that she's Nicola Gobbo, and there's now going to be a Royal Commission in Victoria about how this perversion of justice could happen. But of course, judges can give out suppression orders once they're appointed. They're not accountable to anybody. And of course, we've seen with, for example, Brexit in the UK, they can just make up laws and basically restrict the democratically elected leader.
And we have seen in New Zealand as well, a lot of suppression orders used by the courts, handing down pathetic sentences. In fact, there was just one that came up. I've had a couple. I won't bring it up now. But the judge will release people on bail or release criminals. They'll be okay, and off they go and commit another crime. And the judges themselves, they're never accountable for any of the the crimes that are committed by criminals that they let off easy, or by people they give name suppression to. And a big thing in the family courts as well is the the family courts are criticised for being very biased against men, and then the lives that they destroy. These judges can never be held accountable for the decisions that they make.
We saw also recently John Jarratt, who's one of Australia's most well-known actors. Have you seen the Wolf Creek movies?
No.
Oh, it's probably Australia's most well-known horror movie. It's about this outback guy, Mick Taylor, who goes around murdering foreign tourists.
Well, that's the kind of public image you're after in Australia, aren't you?
Yes. But he was accused of rape from 40 years ago. It went to trial. He was found not guilty, but his accuser, she still got to have her name suppressed, even though obviously he'd been found not guilty, which means that her allegation was proved to be false. So he's had his professional reputation damaged, but she still gets to have no scrutiny.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's, there's a possibility in that case where there wasn't enough evidence, and then maybe, but that's not a case. That's not still not a good case for name suppression. The only case really where name suppression should be used is if the victims, in the case where the victims would be harmed by the name of the perpetrator being known. Basically, that's really the only good case for name suppression.
We've just ticked over an hour. We've got we've got two more topics. Do you still want to keep going, or
should we go on for a little bit longer? I think we'll go on. The chat can let us know if we're too over time here. I'm happy to go through the last few items.
Not feeling too sleepy?
No, it's all fine. I'm all well recovered from last week, so we got 5 or 10 more minutes.
We're currently debating in Australia, or the media's debating if ISIS brides and their children should be allowed back into Australia. And Labor's shadow Home Affairs Minister is Christina Keneally. I'm not sure if you know who she is.
No.
She was born in the United States. She grew up in the state of Ohio, but she came to Australia and became a member of the New South Wales Parliament, and soon became appointed Premier when she won a ballot of Labor MPs. She was supported by the two state Labor power brokers at the time, Eddie Obeid and Joe Tripodi. And Eddie Obeid is now in jail, and there's been a book written about him that says he's the most corrupt politician that ever existed in Australia. And she's tried to distance herself from her association with him. She said when she became Premier, "I'm nobody's puppet, I'm nobody's girl." But of course, who got the numbers for her? So she got voted out at the 2011 New South Wales state election in a landslide. Then she became CEO of Basketball Australia for a few years, then left. Then she became Sky News host. Then she left to contest the Benelog by-election, which was another dual citizen constitutional by-election. She was the Labor candidate. It was a reasonably safe Liberal seat. She, of course, wanted to win. She managed to get a 5% swing, but the margin was 10%, so she still lost. But then she got to fill the casual vacancy when Sam Dastyari, do you remember him? Shanghai Sam?
I do remember Shanghai Sam.
Who Labor senator had to resign after his relationships with one Chinese businessman who's now being banned from Australia was revealed. So she got that casual vacancy. And then after Labor lost the election, she became the deputy Labor Senate leader, because she was first allowed on the Labor front bench because Ed Husic gave up his front bench seat for a woman, And then
that's a very Labor Party thing to do here.
And then the deputy Labor Senate leader, Don Farrell, gave up his position for her. And so she had two men give up their positions for her so she could be deputy Labor Senate leader, and she was given shadow Home Affairs. And she's tried to, because Peter Dutton and the immigration ministers before him, Scott Morrison, have now stopped the boats. She's tried to say, "Oh, look at all these asylum seekers coming by plane. What are you going to do about that?" As if Labor has a leg to stand on border security. Well, she believes that Australia has a moral and legal and ethical obligation to accept these ISIS brides and children back, because, well, the children are innocent, and of course some women were naive and thought they were just going on a great adventure, because of course some feminists believe that women aren't responsible for their actions.
No, and I think you can broaden that a little bit further and say that a very popular left-wing position seems to be that nobody is responsible for their actions.
We've got another super chat from Antonio Pego. This is for $5 New Zealand. The previous one was $2 New Zealand. So thank you for that second extra super chat. Ask Due if he knows a New Zealand channel across the Rubicon. He's a conservative YouTuber who refuses to acknowledge globalists in our government.
Yes, I do know Cross the Rubicon. I've actually met him when he was up in Auckland a few months ago. So yeah, good channel. You can check it out if you're interested.
Now going back to so Christina Keneally, she's basically still going on with the bleeding heart. Let the oppressed foreigners
Yes.
even though they're terrorist supporters. Peter Dutton said we're going to strip them of their citizenship. They're not going to be allowed back. And there was a poll in the Australian today that said 60% of Australians don't want these ISIS brides or children back. But Christina Keneally, Labor's learnt nothing that this sympathy with non-Australians isn't winning them votes from Australians.
No, and they the Labor in New Zealand has been far more clever in that regard. In that they've said, oh well, if they make it back to New Zealand, then we'll let them in because we have to. And the terrorism, the anti-terrorism bill that I mentioned previously is designed to make it easier to arrest them when they get back. Even though you think that would be very easy to do because you could just charge them with treason, but that's that the left isn't really into the whole treason thing, so that's why it makes it difficult for them, I suppose.
And Christina Keneally, she also made a speech under parliamentary privilege where she attacked the CPAC Australia conference and wanted Raheem Kassim banned from entering Australia.
Was that her? I did hear about a Labor senator who wanted Raheem banned. I didn't know. Okay, that makes sense.
Yes, because mainly his biggest crime was making a tasteless joke about the Scottish First Minister Nicola Sturgeon, which he apologised for. I mean, the tweet was a bit meaner than what Jacinta said about Alan Jones.
I can imagine. I know. I followed Raheem Kassam for a long time, and I can imagine that. And if he apologised for it, it must have been bad, right?
Now, we'll finish off by commenting on the Canadian election result, which, well, they're an Anglo-Spear nation. They are in North America, so what happens there should be of note to us because it could happen to our nations. Justin Trudeau, despite the corruption scandals, his attacks on freedom, and also his hypocrisy on social justice virtue signalling, which his love of blackface, he still won re-election. He didn't get a majority, which he had previously, but he'll either be able to form a coalition government with the even further left New Democrat Party or the Bloc Quebecians, which is the French Provincial Nationalist Party.
Yes, and it's I would just say a terrible day for the Conservative Party and Andrew Scheer, especially because this was the most winnable election that you could be given, basically. And they ran such a soft campaign. They attacked the Rebel News. They tried to be friends with the media who hated them. And he focused a lot of his efforts on Quebec, I believe, which actually they lost. They gained 3 seats there, I believe. And that's kind of a good parallel into New Zealand coming up to our election next year, because I feel like we have a similar leader in the National Party. Simon Bridges is got that similar style to Andrew Scheer, and Jacinda Ardern is most definitely not damaged in the same way that Justin Trudeau has been. She's not mired with actual corruption scandals, and I don't believe we're going to have any videos or pictures of Jacinda in blackface anytime soon either. And so, running such a weak campaign is what cost the Conservatives the election in Canada, and I think it's a similar thing that's going to cost Simon Bridges the election here in New Zealand, because they're not willing to run an actual campaign. They're not willing to stand up with some actual different ideas. They just we're the slightly lighter version of what the left is offering, and that didn't sell in Canada, and I don't think it's going to sell in New Zealand.
There's a lot of commentary that Justin Mania that swept Canada and most of the woke West from 2015 has well and truly washed off, along with the blackface. But he's still going to be Canada's Prime Minister for another 4 years unless a coalition government collapses. And you talked about how Jacinta Ardern, the Stardust has gone off, but she can still get re-elected.
That's right. She's still polling higher than she polled on election day. 2 years ago. And Trudeau, he could probably form a minority government. Whether they'll do an actual deal with the New Democrats or the Quebec nationalists remains to be seen. But he likely will be able to govern in some way with a minority government. That doesn't spell much success for him in 4 years. He is on the way out, but they could have run a proper campaign to get rid of him now, instead of saying, oh, well, we'll give it another 4 years. And so we may see a similar thing with Jacinda if the stardust continues to wane. She may return in a slightly weakened position. She may return in a slightly stronger position. It's difficult to tell at this point because we're still a year away from the election. But she's got some options for a coalition, as she's got at the moment, with New Zealand First and the Greens, and one way or the other, she'll be able to look at that. And just like Justin Trudeau in Canada, he can look at the over at the New Democrats and at the Bloc Québécois, and the Conservatives over there don't really have any friends either.
It's been talked about that this result, it shows that Canada is fractured, because the Conservatives actually, they got the highest primary vote, but because all their vote was concentrated in Alberta and the other Midwestern Canadian provinces, it means that it was all wasted. They didn't win the seats that they needed to. And of course, the Bloc Quebecians, they're only focused on Quebec, which is French Canada, and so they pretty much made a clean sweep of all of all those seats there. And so you're basically seeing that Canada, it's becoming the culture in all of the different provinces is becoming more defined, and there's talk now that Quebec, there might be a new secessionist movement, which this is one of the things that actually irritated me watching the Canadian election, is that they've always got to do their speeches in both English and French. And of course, actually, most of the time, bilingual nations do not work. For example, Belgium, they've had gridlocked government there for many years between the French and Dutch-speaking parts of the country.
Yes, and I've noticed that too in the and I believe the Rebel was really talking about that. Ezra Levant was saying you can't have an Anglo be the Conservative Party leader either, because they've got to be able to speak French as well, or you can't win a national election, and that makes life incredibly difficult over there. And the talk of secession apparently is even increased in Alberta as well, because they won. Conservatives won 80% of the vote there. Like, it's basically a complete one-party state in the little state there, and they're saying, well, the rest of Canada hates us. Maybe we should go our own way. And Quebec obviously has been talking about secession for 100 years or more. Whether they will get there will remain to be seen, but they'll be in the strongest position for that since that they've ever been.
I support secession everywhere. I support Scottish independence. There's a lot of talk about Western Australia seceding from Eastern Australia, which I support. It's across most of Australia's population is on the east coast, and so the west gets neglected. And so if they want to be independent, I think that should be respected. And I know one of the New Zealanders I interviewed on my old program, The Unshackled Ways, was Solomon Torkilson, and he's Southern independence. He's quite keen on that, and which was a thing in Dominion New Zealand.
Yes, the South Island independence movement is probably about as old as New Zealand. Whether it will get anywhere in New Zealand will remain to be seen. But I'm always a big fan of more devolved and decentralized powers, and having a system of states and more of a federal system with less power concentrated at the top is absolutely something I'm always more in favor of. but I don't really see it happening in New Zealand. On the whole, you'll see New Zealand favours sort of a strong national government. Has always been the main theme in New Zealand.
I did a poll on my Facebook page today because obviously Trudeau's victory, it reminds you of how Jacinda Ardern could skate through next year, but it reminded me of the Victorian 2018 state election where Daniel Andrews, he'd had a scandal plagued 4 years, yet he won a landslide re-election, and that was also due to a mediocre state opposition. So I did a poll, which re-election is more perplexing, Daniel Andrews or Justin Trudeau? And of course, the poll was perplexing for my audience because they're like, why can't we choose both? I sort of like to do those sort of, which is the worst? That's the sort of polls I like to do.
The polls that upset everyone and make it difficult to choose are the good ones. And I think people can tell you it's a difficult choice there for you guys. But yeah, I think we may end up in a similar situation. I can't predict the election a year out, but if we do end up in a position where Jacinda's re-elected for another 3 years, people will probably be head scratching in the same way. But I try and be as clear as I can in this show that, hey, look, if you're not going to run a real opposition, then you can't win an election. They usually like to say that the election is a government's election to lose. But if there's no opposition to seize the day, then the government is going to struggle to lose the election.
And of course, if the mainstream media, like the current government, like they did in Canada, then...
And they will in New Zealand, yes.
Yes, then it makes it even easier as well. That's, again, the public's right to know what we decide to publish. That's basically it.
Yeah, it is. Very good. It's probably an excellent place to end since we've
gone
over time now. It's been
one
good.
more super chat from Clark Key. A few bucks for your NZ Australia dialogue and your tolerance of the chat. I love the chat. It's half the fun. That was for 5 New Zealand dollars. So clearly these are New Zealand people who are sending through the super chats.
That's good to know. I'm providing you with a good audience, Tim. And if the New Zealand people over on the Unshackled chat, if you go and subscribe to the Right Minds NZ YouTube channel, you can help us get up to accepting our own super chats soon.
And you also have a donation page on the rightminds.nz website.
That's right. Just go to rightminds.nz/donate, and all of the details are there if you'd like to support us directly. And Tim has got a donation page as well.
Yes, the unshackled.net/donate, and of course our membership program, the unshackled.net/membership, and we've finally got our Subscribestar account approved, which is subscribestar.com/the unshackled. That's the free speech version of Patreon, because when they were deplatformed by PayPal Subscribestar, they just got a different payment processor. So they've been pretty solid. They haven't cucked or given up.
Excellent. And thank you to the New Zealand channel for sticking around. I see more than half our audience stuck around to the end, so that's excellent for the extra 20 minutes. And yeah, it's nearly 10:30 here, so that's the end of it for me. Thank you, and good night to everyone.
Yep, and tomorrow night I'll be back 7 p.m. Melbourne time with Wilmsfront, and then after that it's on 8:15 p.m. Melbourne time, it's Dear Beltran's weekly live stream. I won't go through the whole Australian alt media lineup right now. I'll tell you all about it again tomorrow night, but just watch tomorrow nights, and I'll plug the rest of it because I know Due wants to go now.
Thank you, and we'll see you all next week at 9 p.m. New Zealand time every Tuesday.
See you then.
Thanks for tuning in to this week's edition of Trans-Tasman Talk. To keep up with the latest real news and analysis from the Tasman nations, visit the unshackled.net and rightminds.nz.